It's a very interesting topic that we have for discussion today, which is we always talk about economic development on one hand and energy transition on the other hand. The question which we always debate is there only one energy transition happening in the world, or are there multiple different energy transitions? One is there is an energy transition for the developed world where the energy demand is stagnant, not growing as fast. It's more about changing and switching from the current mode of energy to the new mode. Versus a country like India, where the energy transition is about getting new means of energy added to the portfolio and over time the ratio changing, but the existing means of energy, whether it's oil, gas, coal, they are not kind of going away. But then how can rules of the developed world and the developing world be the same? And that's the topic we want to kind of spend time talking about. Before I kind of go into the second, third level nitty-gritties, maybe Spencer, you want to share some perspectives, and Vishal, then I'll come to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I agree entirely. I think the challenges the developed world faces as it transitions are very different to the developing world. And a sort of caricature is in the developed world, we have mature energy systems where global energy demand in those economies tends to be flat or even falling as we see gains in energy efficiency. So that means for every new wind turbine, for every new solar PV panel that is put up, that largely displaces fossil fuels. And so you see this direct displacement. That is very different to the challenge faced by many developing countries. In those worlds, energy is far less developed, so emphasis on accessibility, improving energy accessibility and affordability is far more important. Moreover, energy demand is growing incredibly rapidly, and therefore to grow alternative fossil fuels, even to keep up with pace of demand, of energy demand, is incredibly difficult. And so trying to decarbonize a fast-growing developing economy is far, far more difficult than it is to decarbonize a developed world. And I think there's a danger here when we talk about this common energy transition. Often this narrative imposed by developed economies, and I think there's a real danger that we see governments in the developed world have a blueprint of how they're going to decarbonize their world, and then impose that blueprint onto developing countries where the needs and challenges are very different. So I think trying to make this distinction is very important. I was at a session yesterday when one very wise commentator mentioned that for the developed world, it may well be an energy transition. For many people in the developing countries, it's more like an energy evolution. And so even the terms, the way we think about these things, I think have to be very different.
Very interesting, Spencer. And Vishal, you are from the different part of the world than Spencer. How do you kind of think about this problem?
Well, I think I would agree that the challenges in front of energy transition in India and the India or maybe the developing world with respect to the developed world are completely different. Whereas the economic growth world on an average is at about 2%, most of the developed world is almost stagnating on their energy demands. The demands are not increasing, whereas in the developed countries like India, where we are growing at a rate of almost around 7% today, the energy demand is growing rapidly, and that's why the premium on sustainable growth is high, and I believe that most of the especially India, I think while we have decided to grow, we have decided to grow responsibly in a sustainable manner. There is, if you compare the per capita energy consumption, there is a variation of almost 10 times, 10 orders of magnitude between India and the developed world. And therefore, I think for the basic ease of living of citizens, the energy consumption will need to grow. Human comfort needs to improve. And that's why the challenges here are definitely more, but at the same time, it is important for the developed world to start showing reduction in energy, especially in trying to achieve the same level with lesser amount of energy. So I come from the energy efficiency field. In India especially, we have seen. So one single company, that is ESL, an organization, institution formed by the government of government of India. We as an institution have been able to make energy efficiency impacts to the extent of 6% of India's peak demand as of now. And 6% is huge when you look at a peak demand of almost around 250 gigawatts. So while we need to grow and grow responsibly, and that's why the premium on energy efficient or achieving more with less is important. At the same time, the developed world probably needs to now see a reduction in demand, and it is only then we'll be able to achieve the climate goals that we envisage.
No, and a very interesting point, Spencer and Vishal. I think on one hand, we are saying that the rules for the developing world for energy transition or energy evolution need to be very different than the developed world. Having said that, there are several things, especially things like energy efficiency and operations efficiency, which has to be common, right? And maybe there is a different learning curve we need to think about when we think about the supply and the demand sides differently, right? So if I had to just kind of build on the conversations, and I'll keep on kind of contrasting both of you because you come from a very different background. Spencer, if I take the point you made around the different rules for the developing and developed world, how do you think the governments need to collaborate or work together? Because there is a lot of talk about just energy transition and the global pacts, but what's the right thing to do?
So just before I answer that question, I just wanted to really support your point about energy efficiency. And I'm also would say, and I'm sure everybody in this room knows, but I think most of the global world look at what EESL has achieved in the last 10 or 15 years with complete awe. And I think it's amazing the emphasis that India quite rightly has put on improving energy efficiency. And I think if many Western governments should stop telling other developing worlds what to do and perhaps learn a little bit in terms of the importance that India has placed on energy efficiency. And that sort of gets to my point about how developing governments in the developed world can help those in developing economies. And it relates to the point I was making earlier. The one thing it shouldn't do is impose the blueprint that it has for its own country and go and impose that blueprint in other parts of the world. So if you're in the West and you say, well, how should I decarbonize my power sector? There's a sort of knee-jerk reaction, which is, well, you close down coal-fired power stations and encourage the development of renewable energy. That may work if your power demand is flat to falling. It doesn't work if your power demand is growing up by 5, 6, or 7% a year. And if you just take some simple arithmetic here based in India, the Indian government has a target to reach between 450 and 500 gigawatts of wind and solar by 2030. That equates to, from here, adding about something like 50 gigawatts of wind and solar a year for the next 5 or 6 years. Last year, India added 13. So we've got to go from 13 or 14 to 50. Now, I think we'd all agree that would be an amazing achievement if India were to do that, if they were to triple the amount of wind and solar they're trying to achieve. I don't think anybody anywhere in the world would expect wind and solar, India to be able to do more than triple the amount of wind and solar that they're adding each year. But if they did achieve that, they made that an amazing achievement of 500 gigawatts, based on sort of pretty reasonable calculations for how much energy demand, power demand is likely to grow over that period, that would account for around 75 or 80% of the growth in energy demand, power demand over that period of time. So you would still need to see a very significant increase in other forms of energy, and most probably a significant increase in coal demand. So closing down coal-fired power stations is just completely and utterly the wrong type of policy prescription for a country like India. And I think what governments need to do is really think hard about the challenges faced by the developing world, and then think carefully about how it can support those particular needs. And so in the case of India, yes, it's to support the growth of wind and solar, but it may also be to say how India is going to carry on using coal-fired power generation for the foreseeable future. How can we help India use that, generate that coal-fired power in a cleaner, more sustainable way? Engage with the challenges faced by the country. Don't impose your blueprint from home onto other countries.
Oh, very interesting, Spencer. I think, the point around there is a blueprint that the Western world is operating with. The India blueprint will be different. The goals may be the same, but the means of achieving them are very different. And Vishal, sometime back we were both talking about, even what Spencer talked about, right? There is so much of focus on the supply side, right? We want to do 500 gigawatts of renewable. We are talking about PLIs and electrolyzers. There is so much of focus on that. But if you put yourself in, saying that as governments and as companies in India, knowing the global context, how should we start thinking about this whole transition phase?
But I think the general idea that we know of as companies with the government lineage and what interaction we have, and when we see the policy prescriptions of the government of India, I think it's absolutely clear. Take, for example, the recent announcement by the Honorable Prime Minister about socializing 1 crore households with rooftops. Now that itself, from the supply side of things, is a huge way to increase power production in a localized manner. The second thing is the most important thing, I believe, is energy efficiency, which doesn't actually get the kind of saliency it deserves, not only in India but all over the world. But then it has a significant latent potential. There are several areas where energy efficiency can do a lot, which can start from this room, where these lights that are there, can we achieve the same amount of luminosity with lower consumption of electricity? Obviously, yes. India has seen a massive transformation over the past 7 years, not only through the socialization of LED lamps and how it could come in. It could come in because the prices crashed almost 90%, 80% in a span of 7-8 years. While the world today, if you go, the prices are exactly the same as they were there in 2014. So various incentives, demand aggregation, creating markets is extremely important. Kickstarting markets is extremely important, especially in the energy efficiency area, where you cannot see energy efficiency, unlike the supply side projects like renewables, where you can see a solar park, which is a visible sign of progress. Energy efficiency has very important imperatives, cost imperatives, cost saving imperatives, but it's not that visible. So basically we need to remove that kind of invisibility of energy efficiency, make it more salient, make people understand the process of total cost of ownership. India is aspirational. For any growing country where income levels are rising and aspirations are rising, the consumer will always go in for comfort products. Like, for example, a person who's achieving a particular income level will start buying an air conditioner. And if he is going to buy an inefficient air conditioner, just because the capex cost that he's going to invest is extremely low as compared to a 5-star AC, you're losing that customer for the next 7 years. Take, for example, a humble fan, a fan that is used by every single house. We have 66 crore, 660 million fans in this country. Most of them, almost more than 95%, 98% of those fans are conventional fans with 78 watt consumption. While on the other side, the demand for fans, the BLDC energy efficient fans, is which consume only 28 watts, which knock off 2/3 of the consumption is only 1.2 million in an overall market of 44 billion in India. Now, a person who's buying a fan today, you're losing that person for the next 7 or 10 years. You're not going to change the fan every 3-4 years. So these equipment, the super efficient and the efficient equipment, they are able to pay back the additional cost in 1 or 2 years. But then that concept of total cost of ownership needs to be socialized, so that people understand that over a period of 7 years, it's always viable to go in for a 5-star or a super efficient AC, or maybe a BLDC fan rather than a normal conventional fan. So strategies across various countries, uh, in various stages, in various stages of development will always be different. There are learnings that can be taken from India by the developed world, and a lot of learnings that we can take from the developed world. In my opinion, there is an option of convergence. There lies opportunities of convergence. And the loveliest example of that very recently came when of a North-South cooperation came in, when the leaders of India and the United States met in July 2023 and formulated a plan that, okay, we need to socialize or increase electric bus operations in India, and they decided together to form a joint payment security mechanism to usher in electric buses. So there are several examples of north-south as well as south-south collaborations, even though the overall schema of energy transition in various parts of the world may be different, but there are avenues of cooperation both on north-south and south-south levels.
Just add one point. This may well be where the developing world has an advantage over more mature economies. When the war in Ukraine happened, we saw a massive energy shortage in Europe. A natural thing for politicians to do at that point would be to have really pushed really heavily energy efficiency, and it would have had both a near-term benefit in terms of dealing with the energy crisis, but it would have had a long-term benefit in terms of the energy transition. But almost no government in Europe really embraced energy efficiency. And I think when you spoke to politicians, you spoke to officials, they said, why aren't you pushing hard on energy efficiency? And it's this sense that the politicians are very nervous about trying to tell businesses and trying to tell households how they should run their lives, how they should use their energy. And so sort of really golden opportunities to really push energy efficiency agendas we're not seeing picked up in the developed world. And perhaps, again, I say other parts of the world should look at the sort of the lesson, an example that India is doing in terms of the emphasis it places on it.
So I actually pick up 2 points from what you guys said, right? I think one, there is an opportunity to glamorize the whole savings and efficiency part of it, right? Because talking about solar, talking about wind, hydrogen, biofuels, big projects, a few $1 million of investment is glamorous, right? It seems exciting. But there is this whole part around efficiency, which is today maybe non-glamorous, but real economics, right? When we talk about project evaluation, we debate IRRs. There is an IRR visible, but maybe that needs to be glamorized because it may not be the best thing to talk about publicly, visibly, so how do you actually make that happen? And two, when we talk about economic development and energy transition, yes, we talked about different blueprints, but at the same time, the learning is not one way. The learning needs to be both ways, right? There is something which we can pick in terms of the emerging technologies from the developed world, because there is a lot of investment that has already happened in many of them. But also in some of these elements like energy efficiency, the way we think, the way we approach, there are so many learnings we can bring backwards. Spencer, I have one question.
No, I'm just going to say one final point. So Prime Minister Modi often talks about the quadrilemma of energy, and the quadrilemma of energy being affordability, accessibility, security, and sustainability. And the idea that it's a quadrilemma is there's a trade-off between those two things. It's hard to solve all four of them at the same time. There is one magic silver bullet that solves all four at the same time, and it's energy efficiency.
Yeah. No, but Spencer, the question then in my mind is, as BP, you actually straddle both parts of the world, right? There is the global north, global south, but you operate in both parts of the world. What can companies like you actually do to make this happen? Yes, there is government part of it, but also companies, MNCs working across both parts of this world. How can they actually help solve some of this?
So I think there's roles that BP can play in terms of trying to bring learnings to other parts of the world. But I'm very nervous when trying to bring learnings in other parts of the world, because I think the most important thing is they have to work with the country and the needs of that country. And that's sort of, I think, in some sense, what BP is doing here in India and has been doing here for many years. So in terms of BP in India today, together with our partner Reliance, we provide a third of India's domestic gas production. So we're working incredibly hard in terms of providing the natural gas India needs today. But at the same time, we're actively investing in all sorts of upstream non-fossil fuels to try to help make sure that we can help India transition over a period of time. And the same is true in downstream. Today, we have businesses which are providing natural gas to companies throughout India. We have, again, with Reliance, we have our GeoBP footprint in terms of providing diesel and gasoline on the forecourts. But we're also actively investing in various forms of electrification companies and venturing in various forms of electric transport companies. So I think for companies like us, you provide the energy the country needs today, but you also bring some of that learnings and some of that balance sheet capability to help start to produce the capacity for that country to gradually move to a cleaner, more sustainable energy mix into the future.
So since you're saying that there is a portfolio that you can bring to the play, depending on the dynamics of the country. And if I take this to Vishal, right? And Vishal, I know I wanted to touch upon a very different now on this same topic. You and a lot of the people here are from the oil and gas background, right? When you do your conversations with a lot of your counterparts in the oil and gas industry, and you're trying to make a business case, saying that there is an energy efficiency that we need to drive, there is value, they are struggling with a very different kind of a challenge. They are saying we need to grow our capacities in terms of the core business because there is need for the core energy. We need to invest in the alternate energy because that's some part of the future portfolio, as you said, we'll bring. And then there is also net zero, which has some part of scope 2, scope 3, which has very different solutions, and a lot of scope 1, which again, where you kind of do. They are struggling with their capex allocations, capex balances. So how do you think about it, saying that when you have those conversations?
Well, actually, ESL as a company concentrates predominantly in the electricity sector, not on the oil and gas. Therefore, I would not like to make an uninformed comment on that. But having said that, I would believe that I think some kind of transition which is already happening, that is extremely important. So it's not about probably oil today. It is about oil today, but maybe tomorrow it could be about hydrogen, and a lot of movement and a shift is happening. We may be just seeing a tremendous shift into hydrogen based, especially on the transport side of things and energy side of things, into hydrogen maybe 7 to 10 years down the line, if it happens fast. So I would believe that obviously with the COP28 now touching on the fossil fuels, talking about not phase out or phase down, but moving away from fossil fuels, I think probably time has come that some alternate fuels like hydrogen and all, and a lot of investment is also going on in that. I think time has come that over the next 10 or 15, 20, 30 years, some shift may start happening, and the time to prepare about that is right now. But overall, I think energy security is something that no country will compromise on.
Yeah. And Vishal, just to build on what you said right now, and you also mentioned a few things earlier. We talk about, and one challenge we see in the industry when we talk to both the B2C and the B2B consumers is the willingness to pay, right? You also touch upon the example of fans. will say BLDC, yes, my upfront cost is much higher. How do I make that willingness to pay happen? And that's true for so many of these technologies where you have efficiency, when we talk about the energy consumptions. How do you kind of solve for that, or what kind of thinking we need to kind of develop as a country?
Yes, so I'll just give you an example of several things, and we have ESL as a company has done it in several domains. We'll talk about only, let's say, electric mobility. Creating demand is important. Number one is, if you are able to create the demand, to create a disruption in the market, I think that's an essential element, because if the demand comes in, then market is going to pick it up. In all the interventions, whether we talk about LED lamps, street lights, smart meters, which is now again going across the whole country, you talk about distributed solar, electric buses. Once there, you have to create a demand, and as a government institution, it is important that the demand comes in. Now, once the demand comes in, market will respond and prices will definitely go down. And that is one part. The other part is the depression of prices on one side, the rest of it probably for new technologies or technologies that need to be made commercially viable, some kind of government support is always done. And this is the way most of the things have been done in the past by not only government of India, and you can see several examples across the world. So creation of demand and demand visibility to the market, and providing subsidies and basically phasing it out. We have seen it in FAME scheme also. So these kind of measures are standard measures, and they have to be adopted.
No, and awesome. I think so. What you're saying is there are two parts to it, right? One is the demand generation. The other is how do I get the technology to also evolve? And Spencer, coming to the point you had made earlier also, right? The solution for India may be very different. But if I had to think about saying that I will have coal, but how do I decarbonize coal rather than not do coal? But decarbonization involves, say, something like a CCUS, which is expensive, which requires technology evolution. So how do you drive technology evolution, and how do you encourage that, in a developing world, as against a developed world?
And I just want to make one other point is, for other when technology gets even more mature, where there's a demand there, where you've reached price competitiveness, then there's a role for government to make sure that those technologies can expand at the pace they need to expand. So when people are looking in the US at the moment at the Inflation Reduction Act, wind and solar are a mature technology. The demand is there. They're price competitive. There's no problem with price competitiveness. The problem is there is so much bureaucracy in terms of planning and permitting and grid connections that this latent market can't actually expand quickly enough. So there's a role for government in more mature technologies, enabling those technologies to grow very rapidly. CCS in India, pretty much across the world, is in a completely different stage. That there's a cost associated with that. You're having to do something extra, as well as use that energy to provide heat or power. You're also trying to use it in a clean way in terms of storing those carbon emissions underground somewhere. Somebody has to pay for that process, and so there's a role for government in trying to work out how that cost should be borne and in what way. But also, I think there's a role for government in galvanizing the world. So I think, for example, every time I go to Washington, every time I go to Brussels, people all have views about how India should decarbonize. Nobody talks to me ever about the importance of CCS in India. It seems to me almost certain that India is going to be using coal for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And so trying to change the global narrative about how India should be able to use that coal in a clean and sustainable way, and for the West to start thinking, how should it provide financial support to try to support them and start to develop new business models and new value chains. Some of that value chains may be in terms of trying to find places to store carbon in India, but that's likely to be a relatively minor place. So it may well be trying to develop new business models where that carbon is exported to other parts of the world to be stored securely. So I think trying to change this narrative. So there's a role in terms of, obviously in terms of who's going to pay and how that should be borne, but more generally changing the narrative so people are engaging with the real challenges countries like India face, not the ones that their own countries face, and just imposing that on India.
Thanks, Spencer. And that, I'm also looking at the clock. What I would say, if I really summarize what both of you said, and thanks for bringing different perspectives into the discussion, there are 5 takeaways for me that I say. One, the blueprint for India or the developing world is going to be different than the developed world. Maybe it's energy transition versus energy evolution, and we need to change the terminology and the discussions. 2, there is value in efficiency irrespective whether you are in a developing world or the developed world. But maybe we need to glamorize that part of it because we often don't give enough weightage and glamour or the value to that part of the initiative and action. That's the second takeaway, at least for me. The third takeaway, which was very interesting, was to say it's not always that there is a developed world blueprint that needs to come to a developing world. But as India and as developing world, as we can actually share a lot of learnings back to the developed world. And there is India for the world story that needs to be thought about as well, rather than just world for the India story that we always talk about in the narratives. Fourth, we need to start thinking about scaling up demand for some of this, because that's something which will create the scale as well as make a lot of these viable and things to happen, as we looked at it. And fifth is going to be a bit around the technology. I would say not just technology, but innovative models that we need to develop. The conversations that Spencer you referred towards and saying that what's the CCS story for India may look very different, and we need to find a different creative solution. So that's the fifth a takeaway for me. But very interesting talk. I think we can continue this topic for next few hours if you want to. But that's the time we had. Thank you for giving time, Vishal, Spencer, and thanks for the audience for being here.